Today, Mr. Speaker, this House must declare an environment and climate emergency.
Firefighters say what's unfolding here is more than one disaster feeding off another.
Conditions here just keep getting worse. We are seeing high winds, soaring temperatures, flames like this popping up. You can feel that heat.
Hey, you guys pull back.
Road, yep, get on the road.
Historic drought is the perfect fuel for these epic conditions. But it's climate change creating infernos larger than ever.
Large swathes of China's central Henan province were underwater on Wednesday, following days of torrential rain. Dozens of reservoirs and dams have breached warning levels.
The year is 2022, and climate change is here. Once written off as some problem for the future, the effects of climate change have moved definitively into the present. And yet, the lies persist.
A second message is that, yes, indeed, we have a strategy of getting to net zero by 2050. Now, what that means is that we first of all have to eliminate our own emissions by 2050. Now, many of you say, well, I'm sorry, that's too far down the road. Action is needed right now. And as a matter of fact, I fully agree with that as well. And that's why we have given the teams in Shell the mission to come up with a plan to reduce our own emissions by 50% by 2030. And we're working very hard on that right now. And not just a plan like, let's put a target out there. No, a plan with finances, with real actions, with tangible milestones and everything else that we will put to our shareholders to a vote with the budgets for it.
Why are corporations able to so blatantly lie to the public? How did things get this way? To answer these questions, we're going to have to look a little closer.
So for me, and I think for all of us, ethics is a state of mind. And that state of mind is, I will do no harm in our relationships with anybody else, whether they're competitors or customers. And in fact, I'll try to contribute some good, add some value, help to create what I think is essential, and that's the win-win deal between each company and its stakeholders.
Meet E. Bruce Harrison, public relations extraordinaire and a master architect of what has come to be known as greenwashing. Over his 40-year career, Harrison developed strategic information and communication programs for hundreds of companies in virtually every industrial sector, designed to allow his clients to refit, overcome, or sidestep environmental regulations and the threat of restrictive legislation at local, state, and federal levels, all while persuading the public that their products, aims, and policies were environmentally friendly. In 1972, Harrison, using his connections from his previous work as a member of the Manufacturing Chemists Association's Public Relations Committee, formed the National Environmental Development Association, or NEDA for short, an appropriately vague and green-sounding name for a group of chemical, petroleum, agricultural, and mining companies, pro-business politicians, and labor groups, with himself as the NEDA's executive director. The previous 10 years had not been the kindest to these companies. The blossoming environmental movement had galvanized public support for environmental protection, with many first-of-their-kind environmental regulations being put into law with bipartisan support. Concerns about the environment had also reached the world stage, as the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment was held in Stockholm, Sweden in June 1972.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet.
The resulting Stockholm Declaration emphasized conservation, the redistribution of resources, and state responsibility for environmental damage, both within and beyond their borders. In addition, it established the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP for short, which laid the foundation for future global environmental governance. The declaration also has zero concern for the destructive practices of industry.
Principle 13. In order to achieve a more rational management of resources, and thus to improve the environment, states should adopt an integrated and coordinated approach to their development planning, so as to ensure that development is compatible with the need to protect and improve environment for the benefit of their population.
In the eyes of the UN and the public, industry at large was a culprit of environmental damage and a threat to be restrained. It was this perception that Harrison sought to change. Central to the messaging of the NEDA was the idea of balance. Initially, balance meant to focus on the economic trade-offs faced by the public and their desire for environmental protection. Through regular columns in trade journals, in addition to advertisements and op-eds in newspapers and magazines, the NEDA argued that if Americans were truly committed to clean air, water, and land, these protections would come at the expense of other economic benefits, such as rising GDP or even employment opportunities. This argument gained some traction in 1973 as the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries proclaimed an oil embargo, seriously threatening American energy security. As Americans felt pressure at the pump, Harrison expanded the NEDA's conception of balance to include energy alongside the economy and the environment as ideas inherently bound together that were impossible to be dealt with separately, reinforcing the necessity of industry in both providing for society and in being involved in addressing environmental concerns. Harrison also saw the importance of integrating business interests into the international discussion of environmental issues. Central to this endeavor was inventing sustainability as a neoliberal, business-friendly approach that stressed voluntary and market-based solutions to ecological problems. Throughout the 1980s, Harrison scored himself various speaking engagements, including many UN EP-sponsored events, where he pushed the idea that the more companies participated in the creation of environmental policies, the more effective those policies would be. The fruits of Harrison's endeavors did not have to wait long to make themselves visible. Internal research by various companies Harrison represented demonstrated how Harrison's PR efforts had driven many journals and newspapers to support positions more favorable to industry interests. Harrison's efforts had also found the open ears of US President Ronald Reagan, whose support for business in the free market above all else had made him similarly unwilling to support new environmental regulations. However, the 80s also brought serious attention to a new challenge for Harrison and his constituents.
Concern about rising temperatures on planet Earth heated up a hearing here in Washington today. For years, scientists have theorized about the dangers of the so-called greenhouse effect, the warming of the Earth's atmosphere due to the burning of coal and oil. And in recent months, as David Culhane reports, research has uncovered facts to support that theory.
Following the emergence of a scientific consensus on climate change in the late 1970s, climate change was increasingly brought into the public conversation. While very little was being done to address the issue, there was still a general understanding and acceptance of the science merits, even among the Reagan White House. They just thought it wasn't their job to address.
Even the pessimists, the ones that predict these terrible cases, aren't really predicting large effects for 50 years or so. So I don't see that we should pour money on this problem in the short run. We should have an intelligent program, but I don't see the reason for haste.
Regardless of the Reagan administration's refusal to act, the simple reality that climate change was a human-caused problem, driven primarily by fossil fuel consumption, meant that anyone with a brain could see the writing on the wall for the fossil fuel industry. What followed was a change in tactics.
The year 2085, the atmospheric level of carbon dioxide has doubled to 540 parts per million. What kind of world have we created?
A better world, a more productive world. Plants are the basis for all productivity on Earth. They're the only organisms that can utilize the sun's energy and create matter, food. And they're going to do that much more effectively, much more efficiently.
With a doubling of CO2, cotton growers can look forward to yields that are 60% and more greater than what they are at present-day levels.
For citrus, it would be a very, very positive thing.
Our world will be a much better one.
Before the end of the 1980s, Harrison created two new organizations. The Global Climate Coalition, or GCC for short, which brought together manufacturers, oil companies, and various other industries into an international lobbyist group that opposed action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and publicly challenged the science behind climate change. And Envirocom, an international network of PR firms that would all use the same corporate messaging on environmental problems. Under Harrison's guidance, industry had reasserted itself into environmental discourse. By the end of the 1990s, they would control it. One only had to look at the results from the UN Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992 to see how conclusively things had changed. At Rio, the UN encouraged business community participation, a fact industry groups were more than ready to take advantage of. Under the guidance of Harrison as the primary communications counselor for the US business delegation at the summit, industry leaders drafted their own sustainable development charter to bring to Rio, which became Agenda 21, or the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development.
Business and industry, including transnational corporations, play a crucial role in the social and economic development of a country. A stable policy regime enables and encourages business and industry to operate responsibly and efficiently and to implement longer-term policies. Business and industry, including transnational corporations and their representative organizations, should be full participants in the implementation and evaluation of activities related to Agenda 21.
By its very nature, the charter oozed Harrison's brand of greenwashing, paying lip service to the idea of going green, of being sustainable, of being very concerned about the environment, all while advocating business as usual with only voluntary commitments to change. However, the encouragement of the UN for business community participation allowed industry leaders to put their charter forward as a legitimate solution, staving off other kinds of more binding legislation.
We cannot be complacent unless the agreements reached here are accompanied by real commitments to significant change. Change, of course, indeed, for the human species. In my view, Your Excellencies, we simply are headed for a moment in the 21st century where the condition of our species may become terminal.
While now seen by most accounts as a failure, the Rio Summit's shadow still looms large over all subsequent international climate agreements. The summit birthed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has informed the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its reports, as well as every international climate agreement since. Harrison, meanwhile, saw only success in Rio. In an opinion piece published in the public affairs newsletter Impact in 1992, Harrison argued that industry had become the managing partner of the environment. In his own words, the moment signified the death of environmentalism. By the publication of Harrison's greenwashing guidebook, Going Green, in 1993, Harrison's business as usual with a green facade approach was well on its way to becoming the worldwide status quo. However, a new threat to industry dominance loomed on the horizon, one that under Harrison's guidance would result in a fundamental restructuring of American politics.
We'll recommend the adoption of this protocol to the conference by unanimity.
In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, based on the principle that individual countries have different capabilities in combating climate change owing to economic development, and thus placed the obligation to reduce current emissions on developed countries, given that they are historically responsible for current levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This proved quite unpopular with industry leaders in the United States. Leveraging the Global Climate Coalition and various other industry lobbying groups and think tanks, a vicious campaign against the ratification of the treaty began. The campaign was straightforward and multi-pronged in its approach. The plan called for the development and implementation of a national media relations program to inform the media about uncertainties in climate science, as well as various direct outreach programs aimed at educating members of Congress, state officials, industry leadership, school teachers, and students about uncertainties in climate science, all with the intent of raising questions about and undercutting the prevailing scientific wisdom. Prior to 1997, the GCC spent about $1 million annually lobbying against limits on CO2 emissions. Advertising against the Kyoto Treaty specifically, the GCC spent $13 million.
Victory will only be achieved when average citizens understand climate science. Recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. Media understands uncertainties in climate science. Media coverage reflects balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the conventional wisdom.
It's happening in many of the oil companies and a number of other organizations. They want a clean environment. It's worthy of working for. But let's not do it under the mandates, the dictates of the Kyoto Treaty.
Industry senior leadership understands uncertainties in climate science, making them stronger ambassadors to those who shape climate policy. Those promoting the Kyoto Protocol on the basis of extant science appear to be out of touch with reality.
And that brought out a second point, that a lot of the science underlying the whole Kyoto Treaty is shaky at best. A leading scientist could not answer many of the charges that have been brought up by critics of global warming. And I think we need to hammer that home. That's something that needs to be brought to the American people. The facts about how unreliable the computer models are, how the real world data does not support this treaty. And the last thing that I found somewhat disturbing, but nevertheless it was echoed again by
Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Bush Jr. administration announced in March 2001 that it would not implement the Kyoto Protocol, claiming that ratifying the treaty would create economic setbacks in the US and that the treaty did not put enough pressure to limit emissions from developing nations. In a declassified memo regarding an upcoming meeting with GCC members, written by then Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Ken Brill, the influence of the GCC on US climate policy is explicitly stated. President of the United States rejected Kyoto, in part based on input from you. On January 16, 2021, E. Bruce Harrison passed away at the age of 88. He died as he lived, largely out of the public eye and with little fanfare. Meanwhile, Harrison's greenwashing legacy endures. In the early 1990s, polls showed that about 80% of Americans were aware of climate change and accepted that something must be done about it, an opinion that crossed party lines. By 2010, the American public's belief in climate change hit an all-time low of 48%, despite the fact that those 20 years saw increased research, improved climate models, and several climate change predictions coming true. By demanding balance, the industry transformed climate change into a partisan issue. By demanding balance, the world continued its drive towards the metaphorical cliff, as if a brick was placed firmly on the accelerator. The simple fact is, we are running out of time. In order to meet the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's goal of capping the global temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius, global emissions must be halved by 2030. These corporations have proven on every occasion their indifference to the impending apocalypse that they profit from. It's time to remove their influence from discourse and policy. It's time to hold them accountable for the crimes against humanity that they continue to perpetrate. It's time to call them out on their bullshit.
So, if you're going to sit here and say you care about climate action, why are you currently appealing the recent court ruling that Shell must decrease its emissions by 45% by 2030? I seriously do not understand what goes on in your mind to sit there and say, I'm trying to do better, when you're appealing against being legally binded to climate action. So, yeah, my question is a yes or no question. Will you repeal this? If you care, will you repeal this?
Repeal the appeal, you mean? Or,
yeah.
Well, again, you gave some context, which, by the way...
I'm going to take that as a no. So I'm just going to say, I hope that you know that we will never forget what you have done and what Shell has done. I hope you know that as the climate crisis gets more and more deadly, you will be to blame, and I will not be sharing this podium with you anymore. Lauren.
Don't just watch us.
Join us.
Don't just watch us.
Join us.
Don't just watch us.
Join us.
Don't just watch us.
Join us.